Hello and welcome again to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. I'm going to talk about something that stems from varying experiences that I have in person, interacting with practitioners of varying kinds and their utilization of research for claims or claims that they're making about why what they're doing is working. Now, I've said this with respect to osteopathy very, very broadly. The work is good. You will see a consistent, stable range of positive outcomes between whichever term you prefer, client or patient and practitioner. Essentially, there will be a generally good direction of outcomes consistently. While the work is good, the claims and the stories have problems. I would go as far to say the claims and the stories are wrong or sometimes just absolutely nuts. Now, that doesn't mean that the person utilizing those claims or those stories is crazy or is nuts. It probably more likely means that either they are subject to cultural transmission, so the person that taught them gave them a story or gave them an explanation that they're using, and possibly they've gone out and looked for more information to update that understanding. But it comes from a place that is more cultural transmission than appropriate utilization of investigative methodology or the scientific methodology. I've said many times that any error that is contained within a piece of research or any assumption, whatever that assumption is, whatever error is held, anything that is built on top of that is going to be populated populated by or contain that assumption or error. So the thing that I've seen is that people are often attempting, or practitioners rather, are often attempting to provide some explanation to communicate why what they're doing is working. Now, I can say that from time to time, some of that might come from somebody wanting to feel a certain way, a certain level of security, a certain level of certainty, a certain level of understanding in the explanation for what they're doing between themselves and the practitioner, or sorry, the client or the patient, whichever term you prefer. What I will say from experience with people who are doing that, with the practitioners who are doing that, is they are often appropriately repeating what is written down in a research paper, but they may not necessarily understand how that research paper was built, the assumptions that were made, the assumptions that were made prior to the assumptions that were made in the individual paper or the individual experiment, right? So there's a lot of layers of assumption where if you don't understand them, you can't catch it. So you can appropriately repeat the conclusion of a research paper, the results of a research paper, but if you don't understand the narrow range of the question and the assumptions made in the methods to obtain that conclusion, then you will possibly miss the problem. This is somewhat evident in my understanding, and this is where I am deferring to somebody else who I have reason to believe is quite well versed in nutrition. The gentleman that I'm essentially deferring to is Dr. Lane Norton, or Bio Lane, and he is deferring to his nutrition supervisor, his PhD supervisor, Don Lehman, Lehman. So a story that Lane recounts is often talking about mechanistic studies and small mechanisms as to particular things with respect to nutrition, so ingestion of food and how it would work physiologically through varying processes. And his supervisor, Don Lehman, would simply say, well, show me the randomized human outcome data, because that mechanism may be interesting, but the outcomes in humans may not actually show that mechanism being powerful. So you can isolate or reduce something down and you can see something interesting, but then when you look on the broader scale, it doesn't show up as meaningful as you would want it to. So there are a lot of mechanisms that are claimed within hands-on therapeutics that, if that were the case, you would expect to be able to see something in the larger outcome data. And I don't know that we see it. So if you talk about, say, articulating a joint or pumping a joint to pump synovial fluid, to pump the nutrition through the joint, you would suspect that you would see things like changes in joint surfaces over some scale of time, but we don't necessarily see that. No matter how much pumping of a joint you do, arthritis will continue to progress. In most cases, there may be some cases where some therapeutics that are on the horizon may do something interesting. I'm not 100% sure. But it's just an example to show that the mechanism of passively pumping a joint to move synovial fluid or to increase pressure on and off of chondrocytes to pump some of the nutrients that they will do into a joint may not necessarily do as much as you would want. Yeah, sure, maybe it happens, but it probably doesn't have the outcome that you're looking for it to have on joint surfaces. So identifying mechanism and then saying that is what you're doing in practice doesn't seem to hold as true as one would want it in hands-on therapeutics. To circle back to the assumption, so that would be an assumption. Anytime I'm outside of the patient in that environment of observation, that external environment of observation, and I identify a movement problem and I interface with that movement problem changes, so I restore some degree of motion. Any story I tell beyond that, any assumption I make beyond that is just that it's an assumption. So it will contain errors. So if there's any error in the research that I'm thinking with, then that error will populate my thought. So if I go and look at the research itself and I see step by step and I do my best to understand it, maybe I'm not perfect, but I do my best to understand it, I can see the method, I can see where it would work and where it wouldn't work. I can see to some degree the errors contained within. So if I'm doing that over and over again, then I can gain a better understanding of what the most appropriate level of interpretation is with whatever my intervention is. And in most cases, with respect to hands-on therapy, it's just it moved better or it didn't, right? I'm outside the patient. Any physiological proxy that I may believe that I'm getting to is probably more complicated, is probably more variable within each person and between people than most physiological information would provide me with respect to, say, textbooks or research. So please excuse me as I take a quick sip. One of the things that we're going to want to consider is that any physiological process within one person is going to have variable levels of efficiency. Between people, varying levels of efficiency. So a story that I might have utilized, and I was able to gain this insight from Dr. Peter Attia. Essentially, you can have people who have very large VO2 maxes, so that would make you assume that in any endurance activity, they would be quite successful. Then you can have people who have done a particular activity. If we take swimming as an example, say somebody with a VO2 max that's exceptionally high gets in the pool and swims. Well, they are very, very good at getting oxygen out of blood into tissue. Therefore, their endurance capacity should be high. And it is. However, if you take somebody with a lower VO2 max who's a very, very technically proficient swimmer, the person with the lower VO2 max who's a technically proficient swimmer will outclass the person with the higher VO2 max. And that's because there are other things going on. Technical efficiency is very important in a lot of activity. So if you have more VO2 max than you would need to succeed, but you have low skill, it doesn't help you. If you have the appropriate amount of VO2 max that you need to succeed, and you have the appropriate level of technical skill, it's fantastic. It's a really good match. That's where the mechanism of having a high VO2 max to improve endurance performance doesn't show up absolutely in the outcome data. And the outcome data would show you that the technical proficiency with an acceptable level of VO2 max will actually be the more important thing. So just because we see one thing on paper doesn't mean it translates into, say, an outcome goal in the form, let's say, of swimming performance. So again, to return to the levels of assumptions and the layers of assumptions, seeing something high on paper means that this is what we should expect, and then sometimes you don't see it. To roll that into another direction where there is a push within, I don't want to say science, I would rather say programs of research to do things such as meta-analyses, which would primarily be scoping reviews or systematic reviews with very, very technical guidelines, very strict guidelines on how you do them, so that you can take information from many different previous pieces of research, bring them together and analyze them for signal. So you're doing research on research, or you're trying to identify a larger body of evidence for a phenomenon. Maybe that's a reasonable way to say it. But to understand what those are doing, you have to understand that there are assumptions in meta-analyses. So one of those assumptions is that there is data available on the particular topic that you're trying to assess. It also includes that the question that you're trying to answer with a larger amount of research that you can put into a meta-analysis. The assumption is that the question that you're asking is meaningful and useful, right? You may be asking a question that's quite narrow. You may be asking a preferentially motivated question, right? So you might think that hands-on therapeutics don't do what they say they're doing, right? So you can go and look at the research and you can formulate your scoping or your systematic review so that you can identify the pieces of information that would allow you to assess that question. Now, if, let's say, a field like osteopathy, which I would claim is just bad at science, has low quality research, there are mechanisms to identify that. So one of the mechanisms that you'll see in meta-analyses is a risk of bias assessment. So often when you look at meta-analyses in osteopathy and some other hands-on professions, I would hazard to say most other hands-on professions, the risk of bias in the research or the available research pool is high, which means that in the assumptions in a systematic or scoping review, you would have to downgrade whatever claims are made as an outcome of the research because there is an immediate flaw or believed flaw in the research, which is the risk of bias. A high risk of bias means that the person probably, or the research group probably wasn't as careful as they could be. They didn't control things as well as they could to make strong claims that could be repeatable and believable. So if you're looking at meta-analyses in hands-on professions, some hands-on professions have stronger histories and backgrounds of research that are probably more tightly controlled, less risk of bias. But generally, when you look at them, the only conclusion that you can come to is that they don't do what they say they're doing. One of the reasons that you're probably going to run into that is that most of the research programs and the research questions and experiments within hands-on therapeutics started from the position of I am correct, and then went out and designed on top of that assumption that I am correct, that the patient who I treat who is having breathing trouble, and after I treat them, they say they have less breathing trouble, that is meaningful, that is accurate, that is honest. Well, sometimes depending on what you measured, like if you measured respiratory rate, if you measured things like airway resistance, if you measured things like tidal volume and expiratory volume, and things like that, reserve volume. If you measured that and you saw the difference, then okay, most people would buy it. But sometimes large amounts of the research are just going to take light proxies such as, do you feel like you're breathing better? And then if the patient says they feel like they're breathing better, then the conclusion is the patient was breathing better. Some will be tight and accurate and say the patient reported feeling greater ease in respiration or in breathing. But when you go above that to try to do the systematic review, that's what you'll see. You'll see, oh, well, there's a high risk of bias. The person started from the position that they were correct, so they set up this experiment. And yeah, it makes them look like they're correct. And also they made multiple errors in how they interpreted their data. So if you're going to do a systematic analysis on a field or scoping, like a systematic review or a scoping review on a field like that, you're going to just find problems. It is simply on account of the fact that, well, okay, that's inappropriate to say. It is most likely on account of most hands-on professionals starting from the position that they believe they are correct. Whereas, if you start from, I see a phenomenon, I've observed a phenomenon, when a patient comes into a hands-on practitioner, they leave moving better and reporting a change in sensation. If you start there, and you broadly observe many things. Well, what do all these practitioners do that's the same? What do these practitioners do that's different? If we're talking about the same profession or even between professions, like what do they do that's the same? So if you want to assess between all professions, hands-on professions, what do they all do that's the same? You could come to an understanding of what they all do that's the same. Once you have that fundamental bedrock of the category of hands-on practitioner, what they all do that's the same, you can then step into observing what do these professions do that is different, writ large. Once you've done that, then you can start to ask questions as to what are the general results. So what are the motion-based results and what are the patient-reported results from each of these individual professions? How are they the same? How are they different? So you have to start from this very, very large place, very, very large observation to figure out what the heck might be going on, not what these professionals tell you is going on. You need to figure out what is going on, not what they tell you. So you would want to start from more of a positivist point of view. And a positivist would essentially say there is a shared reality or an individual reality, some people might prefer, that can be identified with appropriate experimentation. However, the observer is the challenge. So if we acknowledge that people are variable and that their thoughts are variable and their preferences are variable, then listening to what they say they do may be less appropriate than looking for what many of the people who use the same classification for themselves actually do. That's the same. That is also different from people who use a different classification. So if you were to say compare a chiropractor, a massage therapist, a physiotherapist, an athletic therapist, an osteopathic therapist or osteopathic manual practitioner, and maybe even occupational therapists. These are all hands-on people. They interface with somebody who is looking to make a change, whether it's subjective or objective. But you'd have to start from that larger environment of observation and then narrow down. So if your preference as a practitioner, so let's just say you're in the nerd wars, or what I would call the nerd wars. You like research and you like a profession, but you don't like the way they're going about research, then you could look to all the systematic and scoping reviews and say, see, there's no evidence, see, there's no evidence, see, there's no evidence. That's inappropriate because each practitioner could tell you that they get a generally stable, positive range of outcomes. They may be bad at telling you all of the not positive outcomes that they get, but they can show you a general arc towards positive outcome, whether it's subjective or objective. And you can acknowledge that the research is just done poorly. So if you want to look at a scoping review or a systematic review and say, see, this profession has no evidence, then you're not appropriately acknowledging that the research that those scoping and systematic reviews are done on is just poor, right? So it would be incumbent upon you, if you like the scientific method, to say, we got to go back to scratch, we got to go back to bedrock and build this up before I can suggest that there is no evidence for any of this. I would say that the evidence is definitely poor for claimed mechanisms of action. That is, I would argue, obvious enough. The claimed mechanisms of action of varying hands-on approaches that I will definitely talk about, whether it be visceral, cranial, muscle energy, myofascial release, the mechanisms of action are probably not observably what they say they are. They are more likely some combination of other things. But when applied consistently, you can see a generally positive range of outcomes. If you observe from that larger lens to start, then you would narrow in. So all of this to essentially note that whatever level and layer of assumption that you begin with will populate everything above it. We're all going to make some form of assumption, mostly based on preferences, less likely based on biases. And what I want to say, as I've said many times, a preference is something that you knowingly turn towards, let's say. Whereas a bias is a mistaken thinking that you do not, as the individual making it, know you are making. You don't know you're making the mistake. And a preference, you know you're making the choice towards something you like. Right? So most of us are going to start from preferences. Most of us will have biases, aka mistakes we don't know we're making. And a lot of that will be incumbent or dependent upon the details that we have to think with. If one of the details you have to think with is you may be on the right track about many things, but you're probably currently wrong about it, at least on some level, then you have a chance to observe more appropriately to identify where your errors may be and where something is actually happening, as opposed to just saying, see, they're wrong, see, they're wrong, see, they're wrong. So I would say that regardless of which side of the nerd wars you're on, whether or not you think cranial is the most efficacious thing and it's definitely doing something to cerebrospinous fluid, or you're the one thinking, no, it's not the most efficacious thing and it is not doing anything to cerebrospinous fluid, you're both starting from the wrong place. the more useful place. Maybe I shouldn't say that you're starting from the wrong place. Maybe I should say you're starting from a place that has less utility than it could. If you start from, hey, there's a lot of people talking about this approach. Why don't I observe the approach and see what actually happens? Why don't I generate a battery of things that I could observe pre and post and see if they change in any way? And if they change in some way, well, now I have something to work with. Now I can drill down and maybe consider more questions about what I've observed. Maybe I can consider figuring out what's consistent, what's stable, and what's inconsistent, and what's unstable. Maybe I can think about what are the general outcomes that are similar between cranial, visceral, fascial, lymphatic, whatever approach that we want to talk about. I should start from what actually happens, what's observable that happens, not what I think is making it happen. Right? So regardless of which side of the nerd wars you're on, you're probably better off to start from observing what is happening as opposed to showing your preference, right? So there's a way that I've said it. It's you can say that your biases are showing or your preferences are showing, but often in how people interpret things and how people ask questions, you can sort of begin to see the direction that they may have come from. But it's like some people will, you can use that in a lot of ways. Sorry, I'm just searching for something that I've heard before that is probably not going to work. It's probably just going to be clunky. So regardless of which side you're on, if you want to be known and trusted to be correct, you should probably start from the more neutral place. You should probably start from the place of what is happening, right? With respect to scoping reviews and systematic reviews within hands-on professions, what's probably happening is there was just some really crappy research done before that you're examining that is going to show that the claims don't match the outcomes. That's probably what you're going to see. So whereas if you're starting from, I'm definitely right and it's definitely doing this thing to the lung, it's like, well, probably not. But if you both start from the more neutral position, you may actually find more common ground than you would suspect. You may find the common ground that there is a way to generate a set of solutions to test on a particular individual that shows up for care and find the one that suits them the best, as opposed to the idea that pain science would tell you that you should do it this way, or that a lymphatic approach would tell you that you should do it this way, that a myofascial approach would tell you that you should do it this way. Instead of trying to bully an idea onto reality, you would probably be better off acknowledging that anything between a practitioner and a client or patient is in shared reality. So that's probably where you should look. So constructivist lenses, probably not the best. Positivist lenses, probably better, but you got to do it right because the positivist lens acknowledges that the observer is always the issue. So a lot of that's definitely going to be abstract. Maybe a better way to say it is osteopathic research stinks as it stands. It's getting much better, but it still stinks. If you do any systematic or scoping review on it, it's probably going to stink. Whereas if you say, I don't like the way these research programs have panned out, I should zoom out and probably observe from a more neutral place, figure out what is happening that is stable, I'll probably understand it better. If not, you're going to have a problem. So anyways, hopefully some of that was usable and useful to you. I look forward to speaking with you again.